Welcome into the GoVols247 Podcast. I am Patrick Brown. I will be joined on this episode by Ryan Callahan. This will be a football episode. Obviously, Tennessee basketball had a great victory on Tuesday night, beating number 11 Louisville. Looked really impressive doing it. Got to catch most of that game. Don't know if you did, Ryan, but a much-needed win for the Tennessee basketball team. And Ben had plenty of good coverage from Thompson Bowling Arena or Food City Center or whatever we're calling it these days. But this will be a football podcast. And Ryan, it's been a few days since we have had one, so we have so much to catch up on. It's been a busy start to the offseason for Tennessee. This podcast will not include much discussion about the Music City Bowl because, no offense, it's the Music City Bowl. It's kind of a one-off. It's neither here nor there. But certainly Tennessee has already started making some moves and had some news that will impact its 2026 season. And so we will get to a lot of that today. We will talk about Tennessee switching defensive coordinators, going from Tim Banks to Jim Knowles. We will talk about some of the guys that have announced NFL draft decisions and maybe some guys that have yet to announce NFL draft decisions. I guess we will talk about the Music City Bowl in the sense of we'll maybe hit on some guys that aren't playing, Ryan. And then we will obviously do a lot of transfer portal discussion. The portal does not open until January 2nd, but Tennessee has already had a half dozen players headed there, announcing that they're going there. And then obviously Tennessee needs to have a portal plan in place because I imagine on January 2nd, things are going to be starting pretty fast and furious as teams look to fill out and upgrade their rosters. But Ryan, have you been able to catch your breath since the start of the offseason here? It's Wednesday, December 17th that we're recording this. So we were going to have one last week, and that was the day that we heard Tennessee was parting ways with Tim Banks. And so we had a podcast scheduled for that day that got scuppered. And then some other things have kept us from getting in front of the microphones here in front of you guys. But we're here today, and we got a lot to discuss, Ryan.
Yeah, we do. And caught my breath a little bit just in time for all the coaching upheaval. So it's been a different start to this offseason so far. We don't usually see coaching changes initiated by Josh Heupel. Let's face it, this is sort of uncharted territory. So we've been trying to figure out what direction he was going to go with this defensive coordinator hire. And now that that's done, figuring out what the rest of the staff is going to look like, because I think there's still probably some additional changes in the works that still has to be sorted out before Tennessee can kind of move forward and get on with its plan for 2026.
So we'll start there, Ryan. Obviously, we kind of discussed throughout maybe the back half of the season about Tennessee's regression on defense. What would that mean for Tim Banks? And we had heard even maybe the week before Tennessee made the move that it was potentially going that direction. Tennessee parts ways with Tim Banks less than a year after he was a Broyles Award finalist for a defense that was really outstanding and getting Tennessee to the college football playoff. And just they went from 7th in scoring defense to 92nd, regression on that side of the ball. We could have discussed, or we can discuss, I guess, a lot of the things that went into that drop off on the defensive side of the ball. But I don't suppose we were too surprised by the decision. I kind of always thought that kind of regression was something that Tennessee, it was going to be hard to not make a move based off that, not react to that. And Josh Heupel did react. He made his first coordinator change. Or I guess this is really his first coaching change that he's initiated. He's had guys leave for other jobs, but making that change and parting ways with Banks was a big step. But certainly I think one Heupel feels like he needed to make after the way the defense played this season.
Yeah, I'm definitely not surprised that he went that direction. Certainly from the end of this regular season finale against Vanderbilt, you were hearing a lot of the initial reaction was that things would not be status quo, whatever happened going forward. And it certainly sounded like there was some serious momentum to a possible coordinator change, and that likely would have indicated Tim Banks was in trouble there, and that obviously ended up being the case. So I mean, like you said, to drop off from a top 10 defense to what Tennessee was this year is a tough slide, because even Tennessee having a pretty average defense this year could have been enough to make Tennessee at least really close to a college football playoff team. They ended up being within striking distance of that as it was. But yeah, when you're losing close games to Oklahoma and Georgia, you had the Georgia game kind of not in control, but a chance to win there in the final seconds and didn't. So that's maybe not just on the defense, but regardless, a little bit here, a little bit there could have made a big difference. And just the way they ended the season too. I think that one, that game and you kind of said it after that game, Patrick. Not many Tennessee coaches lived to tell about it if they lose to Vanderbilt. It's bad things tend to happen when Tennessee loses to Vanderbilt in recent memory, and especially when you lose to Vanderbilt like that. Anytime they've lost to Vanderbilt by a convincing margin, it has usually been in a game where things are already spiraling downward, and that's just sort of a rock bottom moment, or things are about to get bad, because you can't tolerate that kind of thing. Even in a great year for Vanderbilt, it's hard for that to be tolerated at a place like Tennessee, where it's accustomed to dominating that series. And just the way Vanderbilt moved up and down the field against Tennessee, 582 yards of total offense. It was just sort of the cherry on top for what was a pretty terrible year for Tennessee defensively. And I think you have whatever evaluation of Tennessee's defense you had. I think you had to go back and look at it and say, for whatever issues we might have had and for whatever problems might have been caused by Jermod McCoy and Ricky Gibson not being out there, this defense still shouldn't have been 80 whatever in the country in total defense, and
89th, I believe.
Yeah, and all the other stat rankings they ended up having that were not very good. They shouldn't have been that bad. There was enough talent on that defense for it to be at least more respectable, and they just weren't for whatever reason. And maybe there's a combination of reasons they weren't, but it all added up to a pretty bad product. And when that happens, especially at a place like Tennessee, where now Tennessee's got to have some real results next year, I think there's going to be some expectations of improvement, and going into a tough year schedule wise for that to be the case. So you've got to be ready to kind of go all in on this next year. And with that being the case, you've got to have a much better product on the defensive side of the ball. And that obviously in this case will start with a new defensive coordinator, and that's Jim Knowles after what was a very quick search.
Yeah, my final thought on Banks is, and I've said this before, I thought he got a bad rap for a lot of his career. I mean, just the improvement that Tennessee made from 21 to 22 to 23 to 24 was obvious. And he, they had a style of play. They were big on creating negative plays, getting off the field on third down, stopping the run. That was sort of their blueprint. And this season, you saw the run defense drop off significantly. You saw still some of the same havoc numbers with, they scored 6 defensive touchdowns, still a lot of sacks, tackles for loss, but not as good on third down. We've discussed before, was the defense too complicated? Certainly there were some personnel issues with the cornerbacks, and early in the season, the defensive tackles being injured and things like that. But I do think this was a move that had to be made. Banks has landed on his feet. He's going to be the safeties coach for Alex Golesh at Auburn. Those two obviously work together at Tennessee and also work together at Illinois. So a nice connection there. And Banks will be coaching in the booth at Neyland Stadium next season when Auburn comes to Knoxville in early October. But that happens on Monday afternoon. And my first thought was, I bet Heupel has been working on this before this day. And it certainly seemed that was the case, because he moved pretty quickly. There was a lot of Ryan Walters talk. He's the Washington defensive coordinator. He was with Heupel when they were together at Missouri. So that was a pretty easy connection. But they went out and got a de facto free agent in Jim Knowles, who obviously coached at Ohio State. So Tennessee got a first-hand look at his defense with the Buckeyes preparing for that college football playoff game in 2024. That defense locked up Tennessee's offense pretty well, we should say, and went on to win the title. Then Knowles makes a big money move to Penn State. And at the time, that was going to be like the move that got Penn State over the hump to a title, because they had obviously made the semifinals and have maybe had their issues beating top 5 or top 10 teams or whatever. So he goes to Penn State. Their season goes south really quickly with those 3 losses to Northwestern, UCLA, and then Oregon, which was double overtime, Ryan, and they fired James Franklin. So Penn State has a crazy search, not quite 2017 Tennessee crazy, but a winding search that ends with Matt Campbell. He's bringing his defensive coordinator from Iowa State, who's been there for pretty much his entire tenure there. So that makes Knowles a de facto free agent in Tennessee, and Josh Heupel moved pretty quickly and pretty stealthily, given it was about 48 hours between the parting of ways with Tim Banks when they told the team, and when it started to be reported that Tennessee was going to land Knowles. He's been coaching for as long as I've been alive, going back to Cornell, late 80s. But more recently, he was the interesting connection I thought was that he coached for David Cutcliffe at Ole Miss back in 2003, and then for 8 seasons at Duke, when Cutcliffe had Duke winning at non-previously seen Duke levels, or I guess not since Steve Spurrier was there. Then he goes to Oklahoma State. They were bad his first year, but his last year in 2021, they were, I think, 4th in scoring defense and 9th in total defense, won 12 games. Where, if you remember that Big 12 championship game where they almost scored at the end, might have gotten in the playoff that season. But he goes there and builds that defense up into one of the best in the country, then goes to Ohio State, where his defenses obviously were elite, and then goes to Penn State. So Tennessee's getting probably, it's hard to hire a better resume than what you're getting in Jim Knowles. Obviously, there is some talk that his defense is pretty complicated and that it takes some time, which is an interesting kind of notion or kind of thought about his defense, given that Tennessee does need to be in win now mode. I don't, what kind of pressure you think Josh Heupel is on going into 2026. In this day and age, you can't, you've got to win now, right? It's like, Lane Kiffin said a few weeks ago, you're 1 loss from being out of the top 10, 2 losses from being out of the top 25, and 3 losses from being fired. We've seen things go south very quickly at some programs. So what do we make of this hire? I think it's a great hire. It's interesting that Tennessee is going back to the Penn State well again, Ryan, given that they brought in Bob Shoop from Penn State under Butch Jones. Obviously, Tim Banks came over from Penn State when he was on that staff with James Franklin, and now they're going to Knowles, who I guess wasn't in Happy Valley very long, but certainly he's coming from there, and certainly there will be big expectations for him to take this defense and improve it right away.
Yeah, it's a good hire. Like you said, I don't think anyone can complain that Tennessee settled. That no one can, and I think this practice somewhat gets a bad rap, but no one can say Josh Heupel just went out and hired a guy he'd worked with before or hired one of his buddies or whatever. A lot of times that can work out pretty well. There's a reason coaches tend to do that. It's because you've got a good working relationship and you think it's going to work out well because you already know how the dynamic sort of is. And that's one of the aspects of this hire that will be interesting to see in the big picture. There's no history really between Josh Heupel and Jim Knowles. So how does that work? Sometimes you get 2 guys together and it's natural from the start, and maybe they could tell from their conversations that it was going to be a good match. But that's one thing we don't know because there isn't a history really between them. But regardless of that, you feel like you're getting as good of a defensive coordinator as you potentially could have hired in that situation. A very good resume, as you said, and a guy who has produced results at a few different types of places. I think that would make me feel pretty good that he's had success at Duke, at Oklahoma State, at Ohio State. He's been in some different spots where he's not just one with an elite roster. That would be a concern for me if he's only been really good at a place like Ohio State or Penn State. So he's worked with different types of players and made it work pretty much everywhere he's been. And there is that interesting first year dynamic, which we can discuss here, I'm sure, more in a second. But overall, I think you have to be pretty pleased. And if you're a Tennessee fan, no one can say Josh Heupel wasn't doing everything he could to try to fix this defense based on this hire. You're getting a guy that, to some degree, almost fell in your lap because Penn State was not going to retain him. But still, you wasted no time hiring him. It seemed like potentially this was the guy that you had your sights set on all along, once from the minute you made the hire or made the move to part ways with Tim Banks. And overall, it looks like the type of guy that you would want to pair with a Josh Heupel offense. And that if you can, it could work out really, really well. So we'll see what it means for 2026 and kind of a win now type approach going into next year. But you do have to, give Tennessee credit for making what looks like a, relatively aggressive move and going and getting a fairly high profile defensive coordinator who I would have to say is probably the highest profile defensive coordinator, most proven defensive coordinator Josh Heupel has had to pair with his offense during his time as the head coach. So that's a pretty good situation, I think, all things considered. I also, though, at the same time, immediately went back to the times Tennessee has been kind of in this situation where it really needed to win, and it went out and hired what was seen as a pretty high-profile defensive coordinator. In recent memory, you've had Bob Shoop, as you mentioned, which didn't go as well as people would have expected at that time. And back before that, you had Sal Sunseri. And I'm not saying anything about this is going to resemble Sal Sunseri, but that was one that at the time was seen as a pretty good hire. Sal Sunseri was a hotter name at that time, Alabama assistant, and had recruited well there. So sometimes you never know how these things are going to work out. Each situation is different. The talent's got to be there. you've got to pick up the system quickly. You've got to make sure that transition goes smoothly. It's not just as simple as hire a good guy and then add the right ingredients and it's all going to work. Sometimes the things have to fall into place well on all fronts if you're going to be successful. So it's a reminder that sometimes you can get this big name hire and it might not work out. While on the flip side, some of the guys who've been lower profile hires, Tim Banks, frankly, being one of them, John Jancic years ago, some of those types of guys have been really good hires at Tennessee. So sometimes you just don't know how it's going to work out based on the name coming in. But yes, based on the resume and the name, this is a very good hire that should be seen pretty positively, I think, by Tennessee fans.
Yeah, I Shoop is the one that comes to my mind just because that, at the time it was a big move, right? It was the one that was going to get Butch Jones over the top to winning championships coming off that 2015 season. That might have been his best team, honestly. Yeah. And it didn't go the right way because it turned out to be not a good fit. Obviously, the program is in a much different place now, mainly because Butch Jones isn't running it, if we're being honest. But Knowles is in town, and I believe he got here on Monday. We talked to Jeremiah Thielander after Tuesday's practice, and he was very classy in saying that, hey, we love Coach Banks. We're sorry to see him go. We feel bad that we didn't play better as players to help make him look better. But he, very excited to get sort of started with Knowles. But, he's not coaching the bowl game. I had way too many people ask me that after he got hired. No coach ever is going to come in from one job and coach another team's or guy's team, right? Like he's going to start with a new slate in 2026, but he is here. And I would imagine he is going to be in evaluation mode with not only the players, but also the coaching staff as well. So it was interesting to hear Thielander talk about that yesterday. And his good quote was, man, it's like we're freaking freshmen again. Because this is, for players, this Music City Bowl is almost kind of an audition, right? I mean, you want to go out there and you want to look good for the defensive coordinator who, may or may not want you. I think a lot of things, Ryan, are pretty open-ended in terms of the future of this Tennessee defense because you've got a new coordinator. It's under new leadership. He's going to want, he's going to see what he needs personnel-wise. He's going to see what fits and doesn't fit on the coaching staff. So that's going to be, an interesting sort of dynamic. William Inge, the linebackers coach, is going to be the interim defensive coordinator for the bowl game. And it was, so the team is kind of, they're getting ready for that game plan. Right. And Thielander said yesterday, we're doing some different things and implementing some old stuff. It'll be interesting to see it. It's always kind of funny to me that some of these interim coaches come in and while they've been willing to teach whatever they were, the system they were under, they get a chance to be the interim. They're like, we're not doing any of that stuff anymore. Not to say that Tennessee's going to come out in a whole new defense against Illinois, but the players are kind of working through that. And then once January gets here and they sort of hit reset, that's when they will dive into the Knowles system. We'll touch on the first year stuff because, and I'm doing this all off the top of my head. I think in his first year at Oklahoma State, they were 112th in total defense or scoring defense, one of those two, maybe 97th in the other. And I don't think they were great before that, but I don't think they were that bad. But then he built them up. You saw steady improvement to where they got to the fourth season, and they were outstanding. They were one of the best defenses in the country. You go to Ohio State, that defense statistically was pretty good, but they gave up 45 to Michigan and then 42 to Ohio State at the end of that season in 2022. And then you go to Penn, but then again, the next two seasons at Ohio State, they were lights out defensively. Obviously that group that won the national title allowed the fewest points per game and fewest yards per game in the country. They go to Penn State this season, and I think they were pretty good statistically last season up there, but they were in the mid-30s in scoring defense and total defense. And I think they were, against the best offenses they played against the ranked teams, they gave up a lot of points and a lot of yards. Not to say that, that was the main problem why Penn State season went sideways, but certainly there's something to say that this defense is complex, but once it's entrenched and once it's implemented, I think the results speak for themselves. But to your point you said earlier, Ryan, if Tennessee had been mid-30s in total defense or scoring defense this season, shoot, are we, we're not having this podcast now. We're talking about Tennessee playing a playoff game most likely here in a couple of days. So is that a concern, knowing that Tennessee needs to, you don't need to follow up an 8-4 season with a 7-5 or 8-4 again, but also knowing that you're going to be playing 9 SEC games next season, so your schedule's tougher.
Yeah, I think it is a concern because I think it is a product. It's, at least it sounds like it's potentially a product of the fact that Jim Knowles' defense is fairly complicated. And that's a catch-22 because when a complicated defense is executed properly, it can be really good. A complex defense is complex for a reason because you want to have different answers to different things. You want to be very versatile. You want to be effective against whatever teams might throw at you, and that's part of being a good defensive coordinator is being able to defend whatever you might encounter offensively. So I think that is a little bit of a concern, especially because I think that was one of the issues Tennessee had this year. I've made it clear I think that was part of Tennessee's problem defensively is that they were asking a good bit of their players to understand some things, to adjust with every motion they encountered and all those things. They're just I think there were a lot of things going on in players' heads during plays at certainly before the snap. It was just a lot to process. And if you have a defense that's similar to that, you could have some of the same types of issues that you had this year. You would think it would be better as long as the system is using players in the best way possible. But I think there are some pluses to this, to what we know about Jim Knowles' system too. Some things that might give them a better chance of having somewhat of a turnaround next year. I think one of the things that it sounds like he tends to do in his defenses is he often has two edge rushers on the field at the same time. And that's something I think Tennessee, frankly, hasn't done enough, where you see a lot of defenses in college football these days that have, like say last year, for instance, if you got James Pierce and Joshua Joseph, they're both on the field at the same time. I think there's some situations Tennessee does that, but there are probably too many where they don't do that. And a lot of defenses these days tend to do that. Jim Knowles' defense tends to do that, it looks like. So if that's his approach at Tennessee, that could be more of a plus next year. You won't have Joshua Joseph, but say your top two guys come back and you've got Caleb Herring and Jordan Ross, and those guys are on the field together at the same time. That gives you a chance to be a little more dynamic in terms of getting after the quarterback. So there are some things that I think right off the bat could be really good for Tennessee. And so much is going to come down to what they do talent-wise too. I just think they've got some real questions to answer in the secondary. They've obviously got to get better at safety. It sounds like his defense is often a kind of safety-activated defense. Likes to have when he has one guy to really rely on back there, that he can kind of ask a lot of that guy and allow him to do a lot of different things at the back end of the defense. And how well your linebacker is going to play without Arion Carter. So they've got some big personnel questions to answer. How are they going to replace what they've lost on the defensive line? Tyree West, Dominic Bailey, Bryson Eason, Jackson Moy, some big names that played a lot of snaps for Tennessee will not be back next year on the defensive line. So you've got to address those things in the portal. And if they get the types of talent they need at those positions, I think they're going to have a chance to be pretty good next year. But yeah, the complexity of the system is a potential concern. And obviously, let's face it, Tennessee's schedule next year is really tough too. And you're facing some tough offenses. Alex Golish is going to be all about offense at Auburn, much like Josh Heupel, obviously, and Lane Kiffin at LSU. So that's going to add to the level of difficulty for any new defense and whatever scheme changes you might have. So yeah, that's a concern to me, especially just because there is enough of a track record that it looks like Jim Knowles' defenses, even if they're not their worst in year one, they're usually not their best in year one, and you really can't afford a slow start. So I would be doing everything I can to try to minimize the uphill battle that this defense is facing and kind of learning a new system.
And I think it's more system related, Ryan. I don't know. It's not like, to bring up South Sincere again. Sorry, everyone. They're not like going to a 3-4 here. I was kind of going through the personnel that Penn State used this season. It's not entirely different, right? They were kind of based out of a 4-2-5. The nickel or star player, it was interesting to sort of compare and contrast what he had at Penn State, a couple of maybe smaller, almost corner-like bodies there at Penn State, where he had Jordan Hancock at Ohio State. He was a 5th-round pick earlier this year. I'm not sure who took him, but was a multi-year starter at that nickel spot that was a little bit bigger, 6 foot, maybe close to 6'1", maybe 195, maybe a little bit more of a safety build. So, but, you're not having to go from, I don't think the defensive line, the body types you need up there are going to be drastically different. And so it's more of a system, I think, complication than you're going to have to overhaul your personnel. They still might overhaul the personnel, though, given some of the stuff we mentioned there. And we'll talk about that a little bit more here in the second segment. But just sort of tying up some loose ends on the coaching staff too. Remember all that stuff about all these coaches being on expiring contracts? Not the case anymore. Tennessee, for whatever reason, only released about 4 guys that we thought were on expiring contracts. They only released those deals last week.
And by the way, why? I don't understand why
I don't know.
was handled that way.
And I tried to stress that when we were talking about this, because it was like, they may have been done and Tennessee's just not released them. They may have been agreed to behind the scenes, but William Inge, linebackers coach, Darrell Sims, running backs coach, Alec Ablin, and Glenn Ellerby all got contract extensions back in the spring. Ellerby was through the 2027 season, and the other guys were extended through this season, or excuse me, next season, 2026. It was 2 years at the time. So anyways, so the only 2, quote, new contract extensions for Tennessee were last week, where Joey Hall's the offensive coordinator. He gets a big bump to $1.45 million and a 2-year extension. And he had been sort of linked to a couple of different offensive coordinator jobs. I don't know how real those were. It might have been just agent stuff. You never can be too sure this time of year. And then Kelsey Pope, who had a great 2025 between the recruiting class that he brought in, which is now minus Legend Bay, is what it is. But, his trio of receivers playing as well as they did earned him a big raise too. He's up to $800,000, I believe, this upcoming season. This is a guy that started out making in the 200s when he was first promoted. So he's continued to make more and more money for all the work that he's done, and he's getting a new title in passing game coordinator. So the only coaches that are not under contract past, I believe, January are now defensive line coach Rodney Garner, who I would probably say is probably the most likely of the defensive assistants to be, I guess, retained by Jim Knowles. The way I look at it, Ryan, is the coaching staff on the defensive side of the ball is still TBD in a lot of senses, because I think Knowles is going to get to make a hire or two and maybe piece that staff together as he wants, which is interesting because he didn't take anybody with him outside of a couple of a support staff or two when he went from Oklahoma State to Ohio State, and it was the same thing going from Ohio State to Penn State, where he kind of just plugged into the staff that was already there. I do think there will be a couple guys back, but it doesn't sound like it's just going to be plug him into the existing staff when making the move from Penn State to Tennessee.
Yeah, and it sounds like he's going to get the ultimate say in what happens really with the entire defensive staff. So we're thinking it might be just 1 or 2 new coaches. It might be 3. We don't really know. There's really no way to tell what this is going to look like. And part of the trick, the tricky part of this is there's no consistent track record in what Jim Knowles has done in going to each of his previous stops. Sometimes as you said, he's been the only new hire, and he's sort of just blended in with what was returning there, and it seems like he's easy enough to work with that you can totally make that work. But at the same time, he knows he needs to win at Tennessee. He knows what he's trying to install, what he wants it to look like, and all these guys tend to want to work with people they've enjoyed working with in the past. So he could bring someone with him that was on the staff at Penn State last year. He could bring someone with him that worked with him at Oklahoma State or Ohio State years ago. I mean, you just have, there's a number of directions this could go. And yeah, what does he think about the guys currently on Tennessee's staff? We don't know. Part of the evaluation process, frankly, for what Jim Knowles is looking for in the bowl game is, what does he think of William Inge on the practice field and the way he works with his guys? And what does he think of Lavorne Harbin working with the edge rushers and Willie Martinez with the secondary? There's a lot to take into account here. And obviously part of that is assessing the talent too. But yeah, he's got to figure out what his staff is going to look like. And he may already have an idea of that, but he's got some time to sort of figure this out. And it sounds like, again, unlike Tim Banks, who kind of came into a staff that was, mostly already in place, or was it entirely in place at the time he was hired, Patrick? I was trying to remember that.
I believe Rodney Garner and Willie Martinez were there. He obviously knew Martinez. I think
Brian Jean-Marie was later, maybe?
I think Jean-Marie was later, and then Eckler was the last one.
That's right. Yeah. So at least that staff was partially in place when he was hired. So you have some interesting dynamics there. This one looks like it'll be more up to Jim Knowles to decide who he wants to bring in and whether he wants to retain anybody from this staff. You would think Rodney Garner has the best chance of being retained out of the guys currently on staff, but yeah, it's entirely possible that some other guys could stay too. So we just don't know, and that's a big part of this. It's a big call to make. On one hand, Tennessee's relative stability has been a plus. I've had recruits say it to me in the last couple months during the season. They're taking visits, and all these guys who have dealt with changes at Florida and 6 SEC schools ended up having coaching changes this offseason, I think, and to look at Tennessee and see kind of the model of stability they've been under Josh Heupel, that was something they could point to and have that to sell. So you don't want to just have upheaval for the sake of upheaval, but at the same time, clearly some things needed to change on the defensive side of the ball. So what exactly gets changed and what direction do they go? And maybe the biggest thing I'm watching is what positions does Jim Knowles want to fill on his staff? Because part of the analysis here might not just be, do I think Lavorne Harbin, for instance, is the best guy to coach the edge rushers? It might be, do I want just one defensive line coach and 2 secondary coaches? Because while Tennessee had multiple guys, frankly, working with Tennessee's secondary last year, the only guy on the full-time on-field coaching staff officially was Willie Martinez, while you had Ernest Thomas and Alan Williams and some others who also worked with the secondary. So is he going to want a corners and a safeties coach, or even a defensive backs and a nickels coach? Like there's a different ways to structure it, but what does that look like, and what's his ideal staff setup? That might determine, at least in part, what direction Tennessee goes in kind of filling out the rest of the staff.
And again, all that contract stuff, the contract extension dump that came out last week, none of that is really going to change this situation on the defensive side of the ball, because nothing really changed. The only 2 quote new extensions were on the offensive side with Hausley and Kelsey Pope. So, you're not going to, just because William Inge got extended 10 months ago doesn't mean, or that Willie Martinez got a 2-year deal 10 months ago doesn't really mean that they have I don't think that impacts their chances of staying or not staying. So, some guys that are not staying for Tennessee, there have been some NFL draft decisions this month. Jermod McCoy, Chris Brazzell, and Arion Carter have all declared for the NFL draft. Still waiting word on Colton Hood and Lance Hurd, the other 2 potential guys. We'll start with the 3 that are going. Obviously, Jermod McCoy, unfortunately, he didn't get to play this season after he played so well in 2024, but continues to be a first-round pick. Obviously, his chances of being the first cornerback off the board and a first-round pick are going to depend on how his draft process goes, which he's had almost now, I guess, 11 months and almost a full year now to be removed from that ACL injury. So if he goes out there and has a great pre-draft process, combine runs well, all the medicals check out, that'll be the biggest thing with his knee. Then he has a chance to be the next first-round pick for Tennessee. Chris Brazzell, outstanding season, was first-team All-SEC according to everyone. I think third-team All-American from the AP, was the only 1,000-yard receiver in the SEC. I was wrong on Brazzell. The jury was out for me on him going into the season, but he obviously played really well that September. He was absolutely on fire. His pace kind of cooled off there, but still got over 1,000 yards, 9 touchdowns. He's another guy that will have a chance to hear his name called. I don't think the first round, but maybe day 2. Certainly should run well. And he graduated, so congratulations to him and his family. That's always important. Then Arion Carter, who is maybe a little bit more polarizing than the other 2, but Ryan, you talked to Arion Carter, so I'll let you sort of discuss his decision. Certainly he's a guy that, when healthy this season, I think looked like a future NFL linebacker and certainly has a lot of talent, even if maybe his injury this season sort of limited what he fully could be on the field.
Yeah, I think all those moves make sense when you look at what the sort of the evidence those guys were looking at that suggested they were likely to go where they, roughly where they wanted to go in the draft, or where they were comfortable going. Obviously, Jermod McCoy, we talked about throughout the season, that move made a ton of sense, and tough spot for him, frankly, to be in this spot where the fan base and everyone's asking, when's he going to come back? Why isn't he coming back? All this stuff, and at the same time, he's having to wrestle with what's best for his future, on top of whether just his knee is okay. So it was a really complicated situation, but bottom line is he kept getting first round projections while he was sitting out. So, it's hard to really argue with what he was saying. And I think this is one key thing to keep in mind about this. One complication in those situations now compared to 5 or 6 years ago is these guys are able to talk to the agents who might be their agents in the NFL. And in the past, you would have had to wait until you had declared for the draft to hire an agent and get that kind of feedback. And so while you're in that process of trying to work your way back, you might have an agent in your ear who has nothing but your pro future on his mind. And that really muddies the waters, I think, for players trying to think about what they want to do there. So, certainly can't blame Jermod McCoy for leaving, and that seemed pretty inevitable. Chris Brazzell, obviously seemed pretty inevitable from the time he started getting first round projections. We'll see if he makes it to the first round, if he ends up being in the second round, but either way, he's going to go pretty high in that draft, it looks like, and has a pretty bright future if he continues to build on what he did this season. I was looking back, and it's hard to believe Tennessee's not had a first round pick at wide receiver since Cordell Patterson in 2013. So would be a big step for Tennessee. They've had several guys who've gone second round, or at least a couple, but not had a first rounder in more than a decade. So that would be big for Tennessee to have a first round wide receiver again, if he can pull that off. And as you said, Arion Carter is maybe the one that was more on the fence, I think, coming out of the season. Toward the end of the season, I might have guessed that he would have stayed because, frankly, he had too many games toward the end of the season where I thought he was probably putting out not great film because he was playing at less than 100%. And I thought that really might complicate his evaluation. NFL teams, sure, they're going to take injuries into account, but all they can go by is what they have in front of them. And if you've got some games where you're out there and you don't look right, maybe that was because of an injury, maybe not. Maybe you're just out there making bad plays. And so they're, having bad film from some games like that because of an injury can hurt your draft stock. It just can. But I think a lot of people looked at Arion Carter and saw the upside as much as anything, and still see the upside as much as anything. And so I know some fans feel like he's not, to this point, I guess at any point in his Tennessee career, maybe not reached the levels they thought he might. I thought early this season he was playing really well before he got hurt. I thought he was
14 tackles against Georgia, 17 against Miss State.
Yeah. So and the Mississippi State game is where he suffered at least the first of those turf toe injuries, if not both of them. So he was dealing with that, basically the rest of the season, and was never quite the same. I think toward the end of the year, you started to see him get healthy in the Florida and Vanderbilt games after he, I believe, sat out against New Mexico State. So you saw him play a little bit better toward the end of the year. But yeah, if you're surprised by him going pro, it's probably because of that, because you saw a guy playing at less than 100% this year and only got to see him healthy really for 4 or 5 games at the start of the year. But looks like a guy that is going to be, I think has a chance to be a better pro than a lot of Tennessee fans might think, and is a really, really sharp kid. But, again, I think he was sometimes a product of a very complex system that put a lot on linebackers and safeties in particular to read things well and make a lot of decisions on any given play. And he just, I think, started to figure things out more in year 3, and that's for being a pretty sharp guy. So I think he's got a chance to be a pretty good pro. But yeah, some 3rd and 4th round projections. It sounds like the feedback he had gotten was kind of a wide range of projections, from as high as 2nd round to as late as 6th round. But most of the feedback seemed to suggest 3rd or 4th round was most likely. And when you look at the numbers, inside linebackers or off-ball linebackers that are not edge rushers seldom go before the 3rd round anyway. So many guys that are trying to be that 1st or 2nd linebacker off the board. If you're not the first guy off the board, you may be going 3rd round at best regardless. So I think what they looked at is, and what he assessed is, what's the upside in coming back? If I'm already getting 3rd and 4th round projections, what are the odds that coming back would even get me into the 2nd round? And even if I did, if I go one round higher, is that worth the risk of injury and all the things that come with coming back for one more year? And so many players these days, as we've talked about before, Patrick, it's all about getting to that 2nd contract in the NFL anyway. I think that's especially true at positions like linebacker. Running back is often that way. So I think this is one of those positions where being a mid-round pick is probably good enough, and Arion Carter's got enough of those projections that I think he probably made the right decision, all things considered.
Yeah, I think linebacker has become maybe not undervalued, maybe not the right word, but it's just not, there's just not a lot of those guys that are going early. I mean, sorry to bring up Henry To'oTo'o, but he was by all accounts, a all SEC caliber linebacker during his career when he went to Alabama. I know some people will say he can't cover this or whatever. But there are very good SEC linebackers that I remember going in the 5th round a couple of years ago. And in To'oTo'o's case, he plugged right into the starting lineup with the Texans, who have one of the best defenses in the NFL. So that's just kind of how that position goes. With Brazzell, some of Tennessee's most recent receiver draft picks haven't exactly panned out. And you're probably going to continue to hear that sort of that narrative. But anybody spouting that's probably going to be outing themselves as someone that didn't watch Tennessee this year, because their offense was a lot different. So just keep that in mind as the draft process gets fired up here in January. Colton Hood probably going. I don't see any other outcome other than that. Lance Hurd sounds like he wants to stay. There's the situation just he's potentially going to have to figure out with Hurd and David Sanders of who's going to play left tackle. Is one of them going to be willing to play right tackle? David Sanders on Tuesday was saying, it's not that different. And he's only ever played left tackle and felt like he'd adjusted well at right tackle. But, that's an interesting situation. It does sound like Hurd is still lining up to play in the bowl game, maybe less so on Colton Hood. I don't think we'll see Joshua Josephs in the bowl game. Jackson Moy was in a sling at his graduation, so he's probably not. He's going to be probably out of the conversation too. So there still could be what we're 13 days out. So Tennessee has sort of cranked up its bowl prep this week. But what's the latest on Hood and Hurd and some of the other guys that we may not see in Nashville on the 30th, Ryan?
Yeah, most of those are going to be opt-out related, obviously, but there are some guys banged up from the end of the regular season. Jackson Moy doesn't sound like we'll be playing in the bowl game. David Hobbs, I believe, is also banged up and will not play. You mentioned Josh Josephs and some of those guys. I don't expect to play, so it'll be a different looking team out there. You would expect Redarius Jackson to get the start at wide receiver in place of Chris Brazzell, so that will be a good audition for him going into next year. That'll be frankly a potentially fascinating battle with not just Redarius Jackson, but also Travis Smith, although I think Jackson has maybe had a little bit better freshman year, and not just in terms of staying healthy, but has had a couple of really nice catches that I think have helped him develop a reputation for having, as we heard from some players on Tuesday, a really good catch radius. And that bodes well for him going into the offseason. But you've got Tristan Keys obviously coming in as a 5-star receiver who's going to expect to play in some form or fashion. So that could be kind of a fascinating battle for a true freshman battling with another talented young guy in Redarius Jackson, who's going to have at least a year of experience in the system to maybe give him a slight leg up in that competition. But so yeah, big chance for him in the bowl game. But yeah, it's going to be a different looking team out there in some spots. But at the same time, you're going to have Joey Aguilar. You're going to have a couple of your starting receivers. You're still going to have most of your offensive line out there, if not all of it. So it should be a pretty healthy looking team out there that's capable of winning this game for Tennessee, to the extent that anyone is all that concerned about what happens in any bowl game these days. And we'll see how motivated they are too. But yeah, certainly some big decisions still to make for Colton Hood and for Lance Hurd in particular. Hood, like you said, I think there was a little bit of optimism at one point here recently that he might be more open to staying, at least, than some people initially thought, because we were seeing the first and second round projections throughout the season, and we were, I think, approaching the end of the season thinking he's as good as gone. And that's probably still the case right now based on everything I've continued to hear. But at least the first week or so after the regular season, I was hearing he's not completely closing the door on coming back. So, how far did those conversations go? Has there been any serious discussion of him actually staying, or was it just him not wanting it to be a foregone conclusion that he was going and wanting to make sure he was making the right choice? Whatever the case, I think he's weighed his options a bit more, and I think is probably leaning in the direction of leaving to go pro. But we'll see what he ultimately announces here and when he does it. But I would not expect him to play in the bowl game either way. And then the big one becomes Lance Hurd, where he's, I think, still very much on the fence. And part of that might be, as you said, Patrick, just sort of how you work that out at left tackle and right tackle. Is David Sanders open to staying at right tackle for a second year? I think when he came to Tennessee, the expectation was he would probably have 1 year at right tackle, while Lance Hurd, maybe had kind of what they hoped would be a breakout year. He sort of had that, but he's not getting a lot of first and second round projections and things like that right now. So, he probably thought he was going to be at left tackle in year 2 and would have a couple years there. He was asked about Tuesday how he kind of sees those positions. Is it that different now in this day and age, left tackle versus right tackle? And you see some guards get picked pretty early in the first round these days. Lots of linemen get paid regardless of where they play. So it's maybe not a deal breaker, but the guy might think of himself as a left tackle. And if that's the case, we'll see how he assesses that. But yeah, Tennessee's got to figure that out kind of behind the scenes here. What's the situation? Is Lance Hurd willing to move to right tackle? Like we saw with John Campbell a couple of years ago. what options do they have? But it does sound like Lance Hurd, as you said, is at least very open to returning. And that's partly based on his draft stock, I think. And so, yeah, Tennessee's got some things to figure out there, and we'll see where that goes. But I think there's at least, somewhere close to a 50% chance Lance Hurd could be back. And if that's the case, that's potentially big news for Tennessee. If he's not, you wonder, do they look to the transfer portal for another tackle to replace him? Do they feel good enough about Jesse Perry or anyone else internally? What would they do in that situation? Again, going into a must-win year where it feels like there is a lot more of a sense of urgency to plug any hole they might have on the roster and be very aggressive in doing so. It does seem like they are very motivated this year. Certainly not to suggest they weren't doing everything they could to make their team better in past years, but it does seem like there's a little bit more of a sense of urgency to make sure this team is as good as possible going into next year. So if Lance Hurd does end up leaving, what do they do there? If Colton Hood does end up leaving, you've got Jalen McMurray also leaving. So do they feel the need to go get a cornerback? We've talked about the need at safety, but you've got at least the nickel position that would potentially be open, even if Ricky Gibson and Ty Redmond are back. So, do you need someone there at the nickel position? Do you put a lot of resources into that position to fill that need? So they've got some questions to answer in addition to just whether those guys are going to be back. Is if they're not going to be back, how do you go about replacing them going into transfer portal season?
Yeah, McMurray is going to the Senior Bowl. I think he should opt out of the bowl game. That's just my 2 cents. And then on Hurd, I would be making the Darnell Wright pitch that, hey, Darnell Wright started at left tackle as a junior, then switched to right tackle as a senior, and that's he went in the top 10. That'd be my pitch to Lance Hurd at this point.
It would make a lot of sense. I mean, you could argue he has a body type that's pretty well suited for that too, much like Darnell Wright, where NFL teams might see him as more of a right tackle or perhaps even a guard as opposed to a left tackle. But a lot of guys want to play left tackle because they feel it makes them more marketable, more likely to stay at tackle in the NFL, whatever the situation might be. And it's just that's just where you put your franchise pass protector. You want to be seen as that really athletic, really long guy that can play anywhere on the offensive line. And I think there's this perception that it makes you just more valuable in general to play there. So is he willing to do that? Yeah, I'm with you. I would be open to that if I were him, but how Tennessee navigates all that is fascinating. And then if he does come back, that's probably a bigger salary that you were not expecting to return next year. So what does that do to Tennessee's money on hand to go out and attack things in the transfer portal if a guy like Lance Hurd comes back for a pretty hefty salary? So yeah, they've got some real questions to answer and to decide what they want to do at a few positions, but definitely that spot on the offensive line is an intriguing one because you could go a few different directions there. It could be Lance Hurd. It could be maybe we don't worry about this because it's going to just cause too many issues, and you go with Jesse Perry, or you go with give someone like Bennett Warren a chance, or you go to the transfer portal and get somebody entirely new to step in at right tackle and move David Sanders over to left. So the one thing I do know is in the bowl game, I don't think you'll see David Sanders at left tackle just yet, no matter what Lance Hurd does. I think you'll probably, just for the sake of continuity, you'll probably keep him at right tackle for the bowl game and not go ahead and start that process. But even that could be an interesting dynamic if Lance Hurd isn't going to play in this game. If you think David Sanders is your left tackle next year, do you want to give him a look there and let him try to see if he can figure it out against a college opponent, or is that too much change and going into as you said, kind of a one-off game like this one?
Switching gears, Ryan, we're going to get to the transfer portal here in our second segment. We will start with the players that are heading to the portal. Again, change from last year. The portal is not open yet. Does not open until January 2nd. It runs through January 16th. Players only need to have entered or notified their schools that they're entering. So theoretically, you still could see some guys trickling in the 17th, 18th, 19th of January. But it's a change. There's not two windows now. There's just one. But that has not stopped players from announcing they're going into the portal and some of the wheels starting to turn at Tennessee and across college football. And if you are a program, you better have your ducks in a row well before January 2nd, so you know who to target or who to what positions and what the markets are looking like at certain positions. For Tennessee, it is up to 6 players who are going in. Right now, it's mostly into the roster type guys. I guess Boo Carter is maybe not into the roster, but he was dismissed in November and will be in the portal, obviously. Jamal Wallace, it was a sort of an experiment, I guess, at defensive line. he's going into the portal. Kellen Lindstrom was a Leo defensive end that played very sparingly. Who else? Brendan Ains is a freshman linebacker that they flipped from Wisconsin. He's notable in that he's the first one from this class to go in, or this most recent freshman class to go in, played in every game on special teams. Marcus Gorey Jr., a second-year cornerback, is going in as well. Did I get them all? And Jake Merklinger, obviously, announced, or I guess early Wednesday, he's going into the portal. No real surprises. Most of these guys are from the 2024 class. So, again, we're seeing a second year in a row of, a recruiting class gets to its second year. And if guys aren't playing or, aren't doing much, they're going to be the first ones to hop in and look for a change of scenery. So we'll parlay sort of Merklinger into a big quarterback discussion, Ryan, because there's also still the Joey Aguilar situation that's kind of running parallel to what Tennessee is doing at quarterback, which I think that position outside of the coaching staff is the most fascinating storyline for Tennessee as they transition from 25 to 26. It's the most important position on the field. They've obviously invested a lot of resources in getting George MacIntyre here. They've invested a lot of resources in signing Faizon Brandon, who just won a state championship again, coming back from injury. Congratulations to him for finishing his prep career in the style that he did. But currently, those are the only two guys scheduled to be on the roster for next season. I think we both feel pretty safe in saying Tennessee is going to be in the market for a transfer portal quarterback. I guess the question is, at what end of the pool are they waiting? Are they looking for sort of a veteran depth security blanket guy and plan to roll with MacIntyre? Or are they going, at the top end and being somebody that's going to be going for one of these big name established starters that are moving on from their current school? Where do you think Tennessee is in sort of its quarterback look right now, Ryan?
Yeah, my midseason opinion on this would have turned out to be wrong. I did not think Tennessee would be in the market for a starter. I think the way the season ended might have changed the calculus there a little bit, frankly, because you've now gone into an offseason where you feel like you've got to win next year, and you can't afford to sit back and take your chances with a younger guy. If you're a college football playoff team this year, you could maybe afford to just transition to George MacIntyre or Faizon Brandon and feel like you could kind of roll the dice, I guess, with a young guy, which you don't see a lot of teams doing, to be fair. Look at how many guys from that 2023 class that was so celebrated at the quarterback position. And even the ones who played early, it didn't turn out very well for the ones who got on the field as freshmen or redshirt freshmen. And then a lot of those guys didn't play significant roles and stay in the starting lineup until year 3. Arch Manning and Dante Moore and some of those guys. So, yeah, you've got to assess the risk of playing someone who's never done it before and knowing what you have internally, maybe in George MacIntyre, but also not just, he hasn't done it with the bullets flying and live game action, aside from a couple brief cameos against lesser opponents. So you'd be taking a real chance to go into next year with just those two guys. And so I think, like you said, they've got to have a transfer quarterback of some sort, probably. The question was whether it was going to be more of a, maybe an FCS or Division II guy or someone who hadn't started yet, to just kind of throw someone else into the competition, another capable guy that could be, a legitimate option. I saw some people throw out Kenny Minchie, a Middle Tennessee native who's been playing at Notre Dame. That's a guy that's not been a starter. So someone like that maybe could have fit the bill for someone that you could throw into the competition. But at the same time, he didn't start at Notre Dame. Why would you think he's likely to start at Tennessee? He's probably looking for something different anyway. So exactly what they ended up with would be interesting to see. But now that the wheels are starting to turn on some portal activity, it sounds like there's enough evidence to suggest, at least for the right player, Tennessee's going to be a player for some of the top end quarterbacks out there, including Brendan Sorsby from Cincinnati. That's a name we've heard. Even before he officially put his name in the portal, we were hearing about that one behind the scenes. And then certainly once he announced Monday that he was going to be in the transfer portal, you heard pretty quickly that Tennessee was one of the teams trying to be involved there. He's got family that are now in Knoxville. So that's kind of one of the connections that makes Tennessee think it has a shot there, and obviously an opportunity. But some other teams are looking for quarterbacks next year as well. Texas Tech has already been strongly connected to him, so we'll see where that one goes. But Tennessee at least trying to be a factor there, I think. And then some of the other bigger name guys that you see in the portal, the more proven starters that are out there. certainly I think Sam Leavitt from Arizona State is another one that could pique their interest. What's the North Texas quarterback's name? He's
Mestamaker.
Yeah, so he's the type of guy that could draw interest from them. We'll see, what direction this ultimately goes. But the bottom line is, I think Tennessee has serious interest in some of those top end quarterback types that are out there. So they're at least interested in bringing in a proven guy. And the other thing about that is, did the Joey Aguilar experience change their thoughts on this? They've been, kind of pot committed with obviously a lot of resources poured into George MacIntyre and Faizon Brandon. So I wasn't sure they would be able to afford, frankly, to go after a top end quarterback. That's a lot of money to pour into one position group. But again, it's a big year, and quarterback's one you've got to get right. So if you think that's what you need to make next year's team click the way it needs to, then it makes perfect sense. And certainly I can see why they are after a guy like Brendan Sorsby that put up tremendous numbers at Cincinnati, has a really impressive build, skill set, can run, can do all the things you want to, and had 27 touchdowns, 5 interceptions this past season. So a lot to like there. But yeah, if they can get the right guy, I think they are very much in the market for a potential starter at quarterback. And that's not something I would have expected to say a couple months ago, but it looks like Tennessee is motivated, aggressive, and certainly not holding back anything really, and trying to go after a guy that they think could be a difference maker at that position. So buckle up. It's going to be a fun ride here, I'd say, once the portal officially opens on January 2nd.
Yeah, you mentioned Sorsby, some other guys that have gone in. Not saying that Tennessee will have any interest in these guys, but Dylan Raiola at Nebraska, DJ Lagway at Florida is leaving Gainesville and going somewhere else. You mentioned Minchie. Aiden Chaz was the starter at Michigan State. Colton Joseph from Old Dominion is one. Jaden Craig from Harvard. These are just our top 24/7 Sports top-ranked quarterbacks so far. Obviously, Sam Leavitt's not on there yet. Mestamaker from North Texas is not on there yet. So I guess it comes down to, and some of these discussions and some of these things we've been saying, it comes down to resource allocation. Do you want to be a team that's got a $4 million quarterback, or do you want to go for a $2 million guy and use the funds that you're not spending on a quarterback on other positions that you need? So that'll be an interesting situation. It does seem like Tennessee is not counting on Joey Aguilar being part of the picture next season, which is interesting because we talked to him on Tuesday, and he may legitimately not know what his plans are, or he just may not be willing to know. Obviously, his court case, he's attached himself to the Diego Pavia lawsuit, which is seeking to just basically do away with junior college seasons counting toward NCAA eligibility. That would give him an extra season because he's only been an FCS quarterback or at this level for 3 seasons. So he's just sort of focused on playing the bowl game. What's interesting to me is I think there's a deadline of December 19th or I guess the end of this, I guess it's Friday, for the NCAA to respond to the filing of that lawsuit. So how quickly do things happen there? And if that happens quickly, does Tennessee pivot and say, fine, we'll just ride with Joey? If it drags out, Tennessee obviously is not really as you touched on, Ryan, sitting back and waiting. So if Tennessee finds somebody that they like and they make a big move, and Joey Aguilar's kind of sitting there, does he, I think he would have to go in the portal to keep his options open of playing next season somewhere. So it's all very interesting, very fascinating. What does George MacIntyre think of all this? My sort of stance on this, I'll just offer my opinion here. What I would do if I was Tennessee is I would go swing for a guy that could be an impact starter, but maybe a short-term guy. And I would sort of bank on Faizon being my succession plan, right? Because, some of these guys, some of these young guys have the option to go somewhere and do what Dante Moore did, right? You have your Ty Simpsons and some guys that stick around at their current programs, but, Dante Moore goes to UCLA, plays a little bit early, then goes to Oregon and sits. Now he's played this season, got Oregon in the playoff, has a chance to be, at the top of that draft class as a redshirt sophomore. So that could be, maybe an option for MacIntyre if they bring in a big guy or a high, big name guy, and he doesn't want to sit for another year. I would think he would probably have suitors in that case. So it's all very fascinating. And it's certainly, as you mentioned, Ryan, it's a situation that Tennessee's got to get right, because whether you trust MacIntyre, if you've seen enough in his development and his talent level behind the scenes to feel good with him, if you want to sort of, not complicate the runway for Faizon, who obviously is very talented too, you've got to sort of keep those things in mind if you're Tennessee, while also trying to win now, like we said. So very fascinating, and it'll play out here over the next couple of weeks. But certainly, as I said, Tennessee can't go into the portal window sitting on its hands, and I don't think they have. And again, you can't. Nobody's officially in the portal yet, right? Nobody can officially have contact with anybody. Nobody can take visits yet. So there are, well, I guess some of the teams that change coaches before they change the rule have some Oklahoma State guys and maybe some other early coaching change guys could do that. But it's just really fascinating, and I don't know which way it's going to go. It's kind of hard to tell at this point which direction Tennessee might go in this situation, which makes it all the more fascinating to me.
Yeah, and it really does, I think, just depend on who you can get, as often as the case in these situations. But yeah, I mean, the good thing from Tennessee's perspective is you have options. You have George MacIntyre and already on the roster, Faizon Brandon on the way. You know, we kind of knew Jake Merkinger was not going to be back. And then you got Joey Aguilar's situation, which is a fascinating wild card. I mean, I don't know that Tennessee is closing the door on Aguilar coming back, but there's a couple layers to that, right? On one hand, you know, does Tennessee feel the need to upgrade regardless of what he might have the option of doing? He had a very good year. Tennessee loved the way he seamlessly fit into the locker room and the way he made Tennessee's offense explosive again in a way it really hadn't been since 2022. It felt a lot more like the Josh Heupel offense we were used to seeing his first couple of years and what it did with Hendon Hooker and Jalen Hyatt and Cedric Tillman a few years ago. But he also threw 11 interceptions for the year? 10. So 10 interceptions and had some pivotal mistakes in some of Tennessee's tougher losses. You know, that Alabama game kind of turned on his two critical turnovers or mistakes there in the second quarter, the safety and the pick six right before halftime. So, you know, you can point to each of Tennessee's losses and probably some plays in each of those where Joey Aguilar's performance was at least part of the problem there. Not to say that that's the reason they lost, but that it was certainly a contributing factor. So do they think Joey Aguilar is the quarterback that can get them to the level they need to be at next year? Because let's face it, that schedule is really tough. You got to have that in mind with everything you're doing, that you've got to be ready. You know, I think the mindset's got to be, we've got to improve on 8-4 against one of the toughest schedules Tennessee has ever played. And you've got Alabama, Auburn, Texas A&M, and LSU. And that's in addition to some fairly tough games like Vanderbilt, Arkansas, and South Carolina on the road. So
Georgia Tech
on the road. So you just can't sit back and accept something that's good if you think there's a great option out there. And so that's part of the assessment here is, does Tennessee think that it just needs to get somebody new regardless of whether Joey Aguilar can come back? And is it as simple as they're not sure right now that they're going to have an answer on Aguilar in time, so they can't afford to sit back and count on that? And so that's why they're looking in the portal right now, because the portal opens in about 2 weeks and they may not have an answer yet by the time the portal is actually open on what is going to happen with Joey Aguilar. And so maybe they just can't count on him. And yeah, with the young guys, I guess I would say I don't know that you have to really make a decision on either way, which one you're going to bank on as being the guy in 2027 or whatever the case may be. But to your point, you do have to worry that a guy like George MacIntyre, even though he's just a first-year guy at this point, and he's going to be a redshirt freshman next year, that he could take this opportunity if Tennessee goes and gets a transfer quarterback somewhere, even if it's just a one-year guy. There are a couple things about that would maybe complicate things for George MacIntyre. One, I think he's got a leg up on Faizon Brandon right now, where if that battle between them is playing out this year, I would give MacIntyre the early leg up because he's got a year in the system on him. He's looked really good in scrimmages and things like that this year. And not many true freshman quarterbacks, regardless of how highly regarded they are capable of coming in and starting day one. So you would have had to like MacIntyre's chances in that battle if it played out this year. If it plays out next year instead, then it's a little more of a level playing field for Faizon Brandon. And with Brandon's pedigree, number 2 prospect in the country on 24/7 Sports, all of that, I think I would be at least a little worried in the back of my mind that it sets up much better for Faizon Brandon than it would this year, when I thought all this time I was going to be competing for the starting job. So does he take this opportunity to say, I'm just going to look for something else out there somewhere I know I can be the starter by next year, even if it's not this year, or whatever? Does he look for a reset? So it's a fascinating discussion. We'll kind of have to wait and see what he might be thinking. But right now, Tennessee's got those guys on the roster and they've got options, and it's a good situation to have at least some talented guys that if you needed to, you could count on. Because that's the other side of this. Who's to say Tennessee gets anybody? They could go after 4 different guys that are all top line starters, and they could strike out on all 4 of them. And then you're having to pivot, and maybe then you decide you're ready to count on MacIntyre and Faizon Brandon, and you just bring in a guy to compete with them, like we talked about before. So there's several different ways this could go. It's going to be fascinating to see it all play out. But all I can say with any certainty right now is it doesn't sound like Tennessee is looking to go cheap at quarterback, and it doesn't sound like they are all that worried about rocking the boat with any young guys. The focus seems to be, we've got to find somebody that can help us win now, and that may ideally would be a 1-year guy. Brendan Sorsby would be a 1-year guy. So you've got some options like that out there, and it could be a perfect bridge to those 2 young guys and give them more of a chance to get ready. George MacIntyre also, by the way, has had some issues putting on, maybe as much weight as you would like him to. I think he's done a little bit better than people might think, because he still looks pretty lanky, but he's not put on maybe enough weight to this point, so he could use the time to continue developing physically and get himself ready. So there's a lot of different dynamics to this decision-making process for Tennessee. But yeah, I think that's the bottom line, is that it looks like they're likely to be pretty aggressive in this. And, how far down the list are they willing to go at quarterback? Is this a situation where they're looking for a starter no matter what, or just only if they get a certain type of guy? That's one thing we don't know right now. So there's still, I think, several different ways this could play out.
We'll wrap up on this, Ryan. We will discuss the where else Tennessee will be looking to sort of have that win now mindset in the portal. And I think all levels of the defense, given that you just changed coordinators, is going to be that. I think Tennessee needs to prioritize safety. I think they need to prioritize the nickel spot, maybe more so than cornerback, where you should have Ricky Gibson and Ty Redmond back. Defensive line, again, that could be across the board needs. I would think you would need a defensive tackle. How do you feel about guys like Tyree Weathersby, Marion Dye? How do you feel about Ethan Utley, Isaiah Campbell, even Charles House? You just signed 10 defensive linemen, so it seems odd that you're saying, we need more, we need potentially multiple portal guys there, but that's just kind of how I guess it kind of rolls. There's really not any, you've got your 5 seniors, and then you've got this freshman class, and then the class coming in. So there's not a whole lot in between there for reasons we can discuss later. The Leo spot, I think, if they go for anybody there, it'll depend on if there's any departures among Caleb Herring and Jordan Ross. Certainly, I think in terms of retention, David Hobbs would be somebody I would be prioritizing to keep, as I think he's got NFL potential, NFL level talent. Linebacker, how does that room shake out? Do they lose anybody there? You should get Jeremiah Thielander back, Edwin Spillman, Jade Prod. You've got some nice building blocks. You got Braden Rouse and TJ White coming in, but again, this is all kind of open-ended because you have Jim Knowles, and he's a new set of eyes, and he knows what he wants. So I think that's going to be, really all 3 levels of the defense are sort of going to be open to evaluation and potential portal ads. Offensively, I think they're going to have enough mouths to feed at wide receiver. They should be fine at tight end if, with Ethan Davis and the 2 freshmen that saw playing time this year. Offensive line, I think it'll, kind of depend on if anybody leaves and how they feel about that tackle situation like we talked about. But I do think they should be looking at running back, because just from a number standpoint, you didn't sign anyone in this class. Does a DeJuan Morris or Peyton Lewis leave? That would leave you just 4 guys there. So I think those are probably the running back and quarterback are probably the 2 most prominent positions I would assume they're looking at in the portal on offense. Whereas the defense, I think they'll be looking at, the secondary and defensive line for sure, but really all 3 levels just to see what Knowles thinks of his roster and what he needs.
Yeah, and running back, that might be just looking for another Star Thomas type, because obviously they did that this past year, and that worked out, well for at least half the year or more than half the year. So that was a pretty good move there. And there are usually some guys like that out there that you don't have to count on as a starter, but that can help you as part of your rotation. So maybe they just go that route. You've got DeJuan Morris that started to play more toward the end of the year. Do they think he can be kind of that 1B type, even if something, even if Peyton Lewis went elsewhere or whatever? I don't know that anybody's going to leave. DeJuan Morris, could leave too. There's all kinds of different options out there. depending on what the situation is and what they think it's going to be next year. But yeah, you got to make sure you got good numbers there. And that's, if there's any position where I think you could still maybe get a little bit better in terms of at least your number 2 and your number 3 spots, I think that's maybe one that you could be open to upgrading potentially. So I'll be interested in seeing if Tennessee gets involved there much with any sort of high-end running backs in the portal. But either way, I think you could use somebody that could at least be a part of that rotation, much like Star Thomas was this year. And then, quarterback's obviously going to be the big one, but do they do anything on the offensive line? If Lance Hurd leaves, that's one to maybe keep an eye on. I still don't know that they get involved there, but they could. And then, defensively, I think that's, like you said, that's going to be the main focus aside from quarterback, is just what do you do at safety? That looks like the position where you're going to see Tennessee probably take a little bit of a different approach from what we've seen in the past. I think they sometimes took some bigger swings than people realized. I will say that in their defense, but we didn't see them often get very aggressive and wanting to break the bank at safety, because I think in the first years of NIL and things like that, there was more of the thought that if you're going to invest money in the secondary, you'd rather it be at cornerback. And I think that's kind of been reflected in Tennessee's success at the cornerback position. And at the same time, it was reflected this year in the fact that they didn't play very well at safety at times, and probably for a lot of the year. And so they've got to get better there, in addition to just replacing Andre Turrentine for next year. So you definitely need a starter there. And I think Tennessee will probably be pretty aggressive in trying to get a pretty good upgrade there if possible. And that might be even more of a priority for Jim Knowles, again, because of the way he tends to like to use his safeties. Another one I would throw in there is maybe a dark horse candidate would be the Leo position. What does Tennessee think about that position and the depth there? Because you are losing Joshua Josephs. They've often liked to play at least 3 guys there. Do they think Christian Gass, who didn't get to do much this year, is he ready to step in there and kind of be that third guy? Is anyone they signed in this class, in the 2026 class, ready to be that third guy there? They just lost Kellen Lindstrom. You've got Emmanuel Okoye, and is there anybody else in that group that I'm forgetting? Not a whole lot. So if you're going to play 2 at a time, the way Jim Knowles' defenses have kind of done in previous stops, do you feel a need to bring in somebody there for depth, even if Jordan Ross and Caleb Herring both stay? That's a fascinating situation. So I could see Tennessee maybe looking for some edge rusher help, even if they keep both of those guys, just to have another proven option maybe going into a critical year. So we'll see, but definitely defensive line. I think linebacker could be a possibility too, with Arion Carter leaving. That's one where I think you should feel pretty good about. Edwin Spillman for sure, and you've got Jeremiah Thielander that should be back, but you've also got some talented young guys who will be expecting to play. Jaden Perlotti played a good bit this year as a true freshman. Jaden Harmon will want to get on the field for sure, and might even be a little bit frustrated he didn't play more this year, frankly. And you've got some talented freshmen in Braden Rouse and TJ White. So hard for me to say that they have to go get somebody, because they do have some talent there. But just going into a big year, you might want someone a little more proven there to replace Arion Carter. And Jim Knowles, again, might be part of that decision-making process.
Good stuff, Ryan. I think we'll end it there. We've hit on a lot of topics today. We appreciate you guys listening, and we apologize for not doing a little bit more of these. We will. That's a New Year's resolution for GoVols247, is to be a little bit more, what's the word, punctual or regular or consistent, whatever the word is for doing these podcasts, and we'll try to do more of them live as well during the week. But we appreciate you guys listening. Ryan, do we have a sale going on right now? Is it 50% off?
We do. Yeah, 50% off an annual subscription through the holidays. So take advantage of that while you can. And the Tennessee fan in your life, if you're looking for a stocking stuffer or still looking for a gift for anyone out there who's not on the site, you can reach out to our folks about doing a gift subscription. If you contact support@247sports.com, they can help you with that. But yeah, it makes a great stocking stuffer at 50% off. That's a great gift for the Tennessee fan in your life who might not be a member of our site and the checkerboard community. So definitely take advantage of that sale while you still can, and get ready for all the transfer portal activity. If you're not on the site, you'll definitely want to be on there pretty soon, as Tennessee looks to continue to fill out its staff and make any changes there, and also get ready to retool its roster going into 2026.
We will hear from Josh Heupel on Thursday, in addition to some players after a practice on campus. The next time we will hear from anybody will be in Nashville for bowl week. So be looking forward to that. Obviously, there's some basketball coverage as well from Ben. So we got a lot going on at GoVols247 here at this time of year. We appreciate you guys listening and hope you guys will check out the site. And as I'm pulling up where's the outro music here? I sound like, yeah, there it is. Okay. There it is. We appreciate you guys listening and hope you will have a good rest of the week. And we'll talk to you guys here soon.